Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming here. It's wonderful to see so many people. I wish the room were larger. There would be more of you, I gathered from the registration. And thank you for registering and coming online. We're happy to have you on Zoom. We're particularly delighted today to have Professor Ueno Chizuko back with us after quite a long time, actually. I know that she needs no introduction, but for some of you, I think she does. So I'm going to give her one. Not as long as she deserves, because then we would have no more time. But I want you all to know that she's really an extraordinary figure. She graduated from Kyoto University in sociology. She taught at other places and then taught at Tokyo University, one of the very few women. She was in the sociology department from 1993 to 2011. Her scholarship kind of falls into different categories. She is known as Japan's leading feminist, but she's also a pioneer in gender studies and gender, sexuality, and family. And that's where she started actually with her work, with studies of the family. There is one in English called The Modern Family in Japan, Rise and Fall. And it was published in Japan in 1994 and here in 2009. And the next category, and I'm only mentioning some things, are her works on gender, and particularly on gender related to A, the family, and B, the nation. And a second book of hers that is in English and an important one in her work is called Nationalism and Gender, which was published in Japan in 1999 and here in 2009. So there's a whole cluster of works in that category. And in more recent years, she has devoted a great deal of her attention to the problems of care, of elder care, particularly, but also of aging and of women in an aging society, because as you know, Japan is one of the most rapidly aging societies in the world. Her books are not only scholarly, she's written many popular books. They are very well read. I can't bring them all, obviously, but this is one that I really like, and it's called Onagirai, or Japan's misogyny in Japan. But, and it's a typology of misogynies that is actually applicable to many places. This would be wonderful to have in English. It's a popular title and sells well. 20 of her books have been translated in China, and you know how much that means for sales. So her books are widely read, is my point. That this is scholarship that reaches the people whom she wishes to address and in the world she wishes to change. The other category, if you talk about scholarship, is activism. Chizuko has been an activist from the first, and she has been an activist on behalf of women's issues and against gender discrimination. She was invited to Tokyo University in a surprise move. It was a surprise in 2019 to give the very important speech at the entrance ceremony. And she let them have it about gender discrimination at Tokyo University. She just let them have it. So it was all over the news. And Tokyo University actually is trying. I mean, it's not fast enough or far enough, but trying to include more women at all levels, not just students, but at faculty and at senior faculty and administration. So she's been an activist on behalf of women, but she's also been an activist against right-wing politics and right-wing ideologies, which have been so rampant in Japan since the mid-90s. The people who are rewriting the textbooks, and in particular, the issue of the comfort women, which has been so central, and Chizuko has been so central in that issue. And that's one of the Nationalism and Gender is a book that comes out of that earlier 1990s period. Now, a book that comes out of a more recent period is one she's going to talk about today. We hope to have this in English too, but right now it's in Japanese, and it is toward a comparative history of war and sexual violence. And this actually places the comfort women in the broader comparative frame, because as you know, sexual violence is absolutely universal. There are probably no universals that you could mention we would agree on, but sexual violence is one of them. So the last thing I want to say about her activism, so it's been feminist, it's been anti-nationalistic, and it's been constructive and creative institutionally. She founded the WAN, the Women's Action Network. Yes, we are. Women's Action Network. Please look at it online, WAN.org.jp. And the Women's Action Network she founded in 2009 does a lot of creative and constructive things for women, with women, by women. And just last year, she founded the Ueno Chizuko Foundation to support young women, preferably young women who are involved in efforts, whether research or project-based or social change-based, on behalf of women. And she has a great line at the bottom of her, I don't have it here, at the bottom of the website for the foundation that says, "We don't care who you are or where you came from. We don't intend to be neutral or what's the other word? Or fair. That's not what we're about. We're about to make change." It's wonderful. I mean, it's a very honest and I think a valuable way of beginning to support younger women without making the criteria and the threshold for support be so establishment and so conservative. So this is an extraordinary woman that whom I'm very happy to have here, and she's learned a new word since she's been in the States this time. It's a very American word. She's a maverick. She didn't know what that was. It's a calf. It's not branded. It's a calf that runs free. It's of someone who goes its own way. She is a maverick in the best sense of the word. Now she knows, right? She's a maverick. And so I want us to celebrate her. I want you to listen to her, but I also want you to appreciate, and if you can, the best you can, to be a little like her, because that's what the world needs. And I think a lot of you are here because you know that. It's not enough to know about it. You got to do something. So here we are welcoming Chizuko. Ueno Chizuko will talk to us about the comparative history of gender and of war and sexual violence.
Thank you, Carol, for such a nice and warm introduction about me. You really are a role model of us to catch up with you. And so you always, serve a role model girls and women to be like. And so it's my great honor to be here with you. I received an unexpected invitation from Harvard, not from Columbia, and they are generous enough to provide me with the round trip airfare by business, which is not the case with Columbia. So yeah, I take advantage of this occasion to visit New York to pick up the old friendship with Carol, and she immediately made arrangement for me to make this occasion to give a speech to you. So it works out very well. So thanks to Harvard. Today, you know that the title of my presentation is just about the same of the book, towards comparative history of sexual violence and war. I'm sure you have the handout of the contents of the book, the table of the contents.
I don't think we have
You don't?
handouts.
I'm sorry. I asked Susan to make it.
I didn't hear that. It's okay.
Is that right?
We'll
Okay.
use the PowerPoint.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay. It's a collection of the contribution by sociologists, historians, and oral historians, which quite, interdisciplinary work together. And we made, a great effort to put them together for 2 years to work out, to interact with each other. In our joint project, we shared 3 key concepts in common. Let me see. How can I go here? So I made my presentation bilingual so that some of you may understand Japanese. And in this joint project, our contributors share the following 3 analytical concepts in common. One is the continuum of the sexual violence, proposed by a psychologist, Liz Kelly. Secondly, the agency of victimized women. The third is the structural violence by Johan Galtung, a peace scholar and activist. The first concept enables us to talk about the continuum between ordinary life and the extraordinary life, but between peace and war. The second category allows us to deal with gray zone between consent and compulsion. The third category makes us possible to see the continuity from physical violence and economic necessity. Then, let's go there. It doesn't work. I'm sorry. We already had the Korean translation published, and we are actually expecting to have English translation and in the near future. And how can we?
Is the clicker working?
Well, I can't move the slide. How can I make it? No?
No, you can't. The clicker's not working.
This one? No, it doesn't work. Okay, good. Yes. Then next. Okay, should go next. Our project was triggered by two books in Japanese translation in 2015. One is Regina Muehlhäuser's book, Sex in the Battlefront, German Soldiers and Women in the German-Soviet War, 1941 to 1945. The other is Mary Louise Roberts' book, What Soldiers Do, Sex and American GIs in the World War II France. The field of research of sexual violence and war was initiated from Asia with the comfort women issues. Muehlhäuser joined at the 2000 Women's International Tribunal like this, as an interpreter to serve this court. And also this experience pushed her to the research of sexual violence by German soldiers in the occupied area in the Eastern Battlefront, which had been long taboo. Roberts' book was first introduced by a right-wing politician, ironically enough, for the excuse of Japanese comfort women as a universal practice by male soldiers. And she caused anger among the U.S. Veterans Association, and that they both cover the diverse sexual contact from rape to one-night stand, prostitution, and romance. And the Muehlhäuser even deals with pregnancy and the children because, sexual contact between soldiers and local women form a continuum from consent to compulsion. However, the question is what is consent and the circumstance of battle. So this is, okay, let's see. No, okay, now it works. This is a very brief chronicle of comfort women issues. Roberts' book was first mentioned in the protest letter. Well, let me go back to the Roberts' book. Okay. Her book was first mentioned in the protest letter by Governor of Osaka, Hashimoto, known as a right-wing politician, to accuse his sister city, California, which decided to build a memorial monument of comfort women in the Glendale. But why Glendale? Lim Hae-jun, you may know his name as a historian, argues in his book Victimhood Nationalism, which sounds very interesting, and it is a very interesting book, as a sign of remote nationalism by Armenian residents. Because, Glendale is known for having this, a big population of Armenian people. They try to paralyze victimization of Korean women with massacre of Armenians during the World War II. Because Glendale is densely populated with people with Armenian origin. This kind of, remote nationalism works this way. Okay, this is the photo of the 2000 Women's International Tribunal, which sentenced to death to the late Emperor Hirohito for the first time in post-war history. But it's not effective, but anyway, it's a civil court. So this is a brief chronicle of the comfort women issues. Back in the 1991, the first survivor of comfort women, Kim Hak-sun, came out to make a testimony in public. So since then, there's a continuous event taking place one after another in different directions. Okay, so why did history ignore sexual violence in war? Firstly, because it's a crime without victims, as they do not claim. Secondly, because there is exemption of responsibility by perpetrators due to the masculine myth of uncontrollable sexual desire. That means men are the slaves of their sexual desire. You can't believe it. Thirdly, because victims are silenced and muted by stigmatization. The paradigm shift of sexual violence was preceded to survivors coming out. That is, a shift from shame of victims to crime of perpetrators. This means exemption of responsibility for victims, saying you are not wrong. In this context, global feminism comes first, then its impact in Korea. Prior to that, accusation of sexual torture by the military dictatorship took place by Hong In-suk. She is the first one to make this sexual torture open to public. Then Yoon Jong-ok, a leader of the Korean Council for Women, drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan. With some misunderstanding with it, but she made a call for comfort women survivors to come out, followed by the testimony of the survivors. Then, in this sense, comfort women survivors had triple victimization. First of all, the forced sex labor by the Japanese military. This is the one thing. The second, long-lasting forced silence in the post-war Korean society, the Korean patriarchal society. Third, denial of the testimonies by conservatives when they came out. They took it as a prostitution working for money. At the beginning stage, their families and communities objected survivors to come out. Then, in the next stage, their negative image turned to be very positive to become a sort of national heroes by appropriation by Korean nationalism. In the third stage, their victimhood was globalized with remote nationalism. Then, the narrative theory and memory studies tell us about the formulation of stories as audience hear to whatever they want to hear. It's called model story. The model story by the model victims of comfort women survivors as follows, something like this. One day, an innocent girl was fetched and kidnapped with no notice and raped to be forced to sexual slavery as a comfort woman. Then she tried to escape but failed and survived a living hell. I put the title of each chapter in blue letters like this. In chapter 1, Yamashita Yon'e closely traced the history of collecting testimonies by survivors, found diversity and variety of the narratives. Oral history studies then considered their narratives not just as a history, but as a story, though it is a way to value the constructed reality of their experiences. Ironically, it undermined the credibility of their narratives. Then, the comfort women issue came out in the historical context of Bosnian civil war and Rwandan genocide, the accompanied mass rape and ethnic cleansing camp. It has brought a paradigm shift of sexual violence from an anecdotal or accidental event inevitably accompanied by war to see rape. From this view, to see rape as organized and intended military weapon. So it means, that each soldier have a one weapon at least, that it's cheapest weapon and attached to the body. It allows soldiers to exercise sexual violence with tacit approval and as organized practice. Male sexual violence has been tolerated with the myth of uncontrollable sexual desire, but now it's intentionally used in order to establish homosocial solidarity among soldiers. It is a symbol of the attack against the enemy's masculinity because patriarchy assumes women as property. Then, case of uncontrollable male sexual desire was denied with a historical study by Kasahara Tokushi. In the process of Japan's invasion, occupied area in China was divided into 3 different zones. One zone with public order in good control, with comfort station provided. 2, a second zone with public order in relative control. The third zone with public order not in control. Comfort stations were established in the first zone, and soldiers who went to those comfort stations committed rape in the third zone. The same soldiers do the different things in the different zones. So Kasahara, this historian, says soldiers completely knew what they could do where they were allowed to do. After all, comfort station system did not help soldiers from raping. And in the chapter 3, Kohei Okada described how soldiers behave properly in sexual practice, and according to the different zones. In 2018, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to human rights activist one, Denis Mukwege, gynecologist based in Congo, and Nadia Murad, a survivor of sexual violence by the ISIS, Iraq. It reflects this paradigm shift of sexual violence in war as an military weapon. What makes war studies unique is the shift of the relationship between enemies and allies according to the stage of invasion and occupation as the battlefront moves. Stage 1 is the midst of the war. Stage 2 is a transition where enemies and allies are reversed. The stage 3 is the post-war time when victors and losers are fixed. Then in the stage 1, there is a clear dichotomy between allies and enemies. In the occupied area, non-military citizens are divided into different categories, such as collaborators, bystanders, and resistance. And women experienced by occupiers takes continuity from rape, prostitution, to romance, marriage, often accompanied by pregnancy, abortion, and giving birth. One thing good with Muehlhäuser and Roberts' books is that they do not draw a line in this continuum. In the transitional stage, tragic reversal of enemies and allies take place, such as from collaborators to traitors. Women who slept with the enemies become a target of hatred as a sign of injured masculine honor. Then their entitlement as victims to speak out is questioned. Then in the post-war stage, war gives a lifelong traumatic memory, lifelong stigmatization, which are silenced. In some cases, it belongs to open secret in the community where everyone knows what happened to whom, followed by the collective forgetting. Because the patriarchal paradigm put the shame on victims, in addition to that of the family, the community, and the state, which cannot protect their women. This is what happened to survivors to keep them silent. It requires half a century for the definition of sexual violence from victims' shame to perpetrators' crime. That's why, those survivors of the comfort women kept silence for nearly a half century after the war. This is what happened to Japanese comfort women for occupation army and women resident in Manchuria in the process of salvage. So we have chapter 2 for this. In contrast with comfort women, so far there's no non-survivors except one among Japanese comfort women to come out because they were considered to be mobilized from brothels with consent for sex work for money. Japanese military brought hierarchy between Japanese comfort women and Korean ones based on the military status of their customers. In chapter 2, Kinoshita Naoko analyzes why it was so difficult for Japanese survivors to come out. Sexual double standard exists in those days to divide and rule between wives and mothers and prostitutes. Chastity of soldiers' wives had to be kept and forced, while the sexuality of a prostitute could be exploited. Though wives discriminated against the prostitute, their sexuality was also oppressed by patriarchy for their forced chastity. Military nurses also discriminated against comfort women, rejecting them to take a role of nursing. This made military nurses difficult to admit the fact they too were victimized with sexual violence by their colleagues, which explains why they report on sexual violence were very few. Then the experience of service girls in the post-war occupied Japan is also unspoken. It belongs to the shameful memory of defeated Japan, which people wanted to suppress and forget. Those women were mobilized to serve occupiers with sexual service by the government so as to protect decent women. They were only prostitutes, but also war widows, breadwinning daughters, and girls who lost families by strategic bombing of all the classes. Their sexual contact varied from rape to prostitution, romance, and marriage. Chazono Toshimi, in her chapter 5, she tried to find women's agency in their survival strategy of making this sexual contact with occupiers, victors. Then, let's see, next. In the case of women in Manchuria, the community leaders were responsible to offer women for sexual service for Russian in return to their safety. Community leaders even made a screening criteria to assign this role to young, unmarried women in order to omit the soldiers' wives whose chastity had to be kept. This is patriarchal male standard to show their homosocial solidarity to brothers in the battlefront. In spite of the victimization of young women as a scapegoat for the community's survival, those women, those girls, became stigmatized and discriminated in the community after they returned. Living in the same community, everyone knows who was raped, but what happened to whom. But they all kept silent so as not to accuse village authorities. There was no witness up until 2018. This old lady, who is the first one who came out to talk about her own experience, and she was aged 94, and so it gives her, a chance to talk about her past story about his victimization. In chapter 6, Inomata argues about the experience and how, that they try to forget about their victimization. Forced sexual contact accompanies undesirable pregnancy, and the process of salvage from Manchuria, the Japanese government rushed to establish a secret facility for abortion, which was then prohibited by law. It was illegal in those days, but they gave doctors and nurses a silent approval for illegal abortion, even with financial support. Some women threw themselves in the sea right before the salvage ship arrived at the Japanese ports. While doctors and nurses made their testimonies, there's no woman who experienced abortion here. With a lack of medicines, they conducted the abortion without anesthesia, but none of them screamed with pain, a nurse said. During the time of occupation with U.S. military station, sexual contact with Japanese women brought unexpected pregnancy and birth. Japanese government decided to make abortion more accessible given the economic reason to the crime law. the Japanese government had an intention not only for the population control, but also for protection of the national purity from mixed blood. Since abortion right has been already given to Japanese women 50 years later, at the time of the women's liberation movement in the 70s, Japanese feminists, ironically enough, did not have to struggle for abortion right, unlike those in Christian societies. And so in chapter 7, Higuchi Keiko, very well-known women activist for the human rights, and she described this ironical outcome of abortion right in Japan, illegal pregnancy of repatriated women and freedom of abortion in the post-Japan in a very ironical sense. A similar community control over the women's sexuality in the occupied area by the Japanese military in China, village leaders and the family heads tried to meet the request by the Japanese soldiers to send their daughters and wives, to the station. After the Japanese troop withdrew, then the Red Army, People's Liberation Army came into the same village, accusing them as collaborators of the Japanese military with stigmatization of women who slept with enemies. Japanese. They are actually victimized, but they are taken as a collaborator. So there was a complicated situation between perpetration and victimhood and forced silence by the community structure, because it was a shame on women, not only on the women, but also on family, community, and on the nation. A careful and enduring survey in rural China by Ishida Yoneko, which is a very interesting book. Her oral history project made a survivor's narrative possible, so that they decided to bring this issue to the Japanese court. They did. One of the survivor women proudly spoke out, "I'm not the comfort woman," because it was not at all a comfort for her. And so she was a communist partisan at that time and harshly tortured by Japanese military, but sexual torture was the least one she admitted. So it was so hard even for the victim to make, the sexual torture open to public. Social contract always imposes stigma on women. This is also the case with the Soviet, women soldiers, reported by the Svetlana Alexievich, a Nobel Literary Award winner, in her book, entitled "The War Does Not Have Women's Faces." When she interviewed with veteran women of Russian Red Army, sexual contrast was the most unspoken memory of women soldiers. She found the gender gap of returned soldiers, men as heroes versus women as bitches. They are discriminated against by family and the community as unqualified women for marriage. Accordingly, most of them are unwilling to receive veterans' honor. So there's such a contrast by gender. Li Xiaojiang, she is a pioneer in women's studies in China. Conducted an oral history project for people living in Northeast China, or former Manchuria. Among them, experience of women prisoner of war of Chinese People's Liberation Army, by the Japanese Army, were particularly interesting. Female troops of People's Liberation Army, or Red Army, was assigned as a rear guard against the Japanese Army in order to preserve core of their male troops. Women were second-class soldiers equipped with very poor weapons, which led them to high rate of deaths in battle and high rate called as a POW, prisoner of war. After few of them managed to return home, they had to experience discrimination against them as women who slept with enemies, even though they are victimized. And, we have this interesting translation by Akiyama Yoko. She's a Chinese studies specialist. And I'm sure, Lee Xiaoji and this oral history project should be translated into English or some other languages. When victors and losers are reversed, the feeling of revenge becomes more harsh to collaborators than to enemies. Under the Nazi occupation, French women had sexual contact with German soldiers. Some of them, the other out of survival strategy. Yeah, some of them did it out of, the whole survival. Total 20,000 French women is said, had the German lovers and children. And so they were, in the afterwar, were forced to shave head in public like this in the photo. And this medieval type of punishment was highly gendered because it was applied only to women. And so far, this, humiliation in public is just imposed on women only. So far, there is no testimony by survivors, but there is a testimony by some of the group of mixed children, but not by those victimized women until the time when a Japanese woman historian, this is actually a Japanese book written by Fujimori. She visited to one of the survivors, and one of the survivors who accepted her interview said to her, this is a quotation, "No French historian has ever visited me." And so it was the first interview she had with this Japanese woman historian. It belonged to the suppressed memory of French history. Then, since patriarchal paternalism deals women's sexuality as men's possession, men behave as a protection racket. It's a quite interesting term coming from some English text. Therefore, victimization of the women means humiliation of their masculinity. When they fail to protect their women, they abandon, offer, or exclude them. This is what happened to comfort women survivors in Korea and women of POWs of Chinese Red Army and with women prostitute, for the women in the occupied Japan. So this is how, men as a protection racket behaved. Though there's a perception gap between the victims and the perpetrators, soldiers can also exercise their agency. In chapter 4, Hirai Kazuka, a woman historian, wrote a quite interesting, article about the Japanese soldiers who went to the comfort station and who didn't. And Hirai argues about soldiers. I saw that. So they also experienced the continuum between love, romance, and rape. Park Yuha, Korean women in literary studies in Japan, was sued for her book entitled The Comfort Women of the Empire, as she described the relationship between soldiers and the comfort women as the ship. They shared the same misery with forced mobilization. Japanese soldiers are also forced this slavery duty to sacrifice their life for the military in the battle. In fact, some women had lovers among Japanese soldiers, and some of them committed double suicide out of despair. When there is a continuum of sexual violence, then who is entitled to claim as a victim? The degree of legitimacy of victimhood narratives depends on assumed participation of agency from high to low. In this context, rape by enemies is given the highest legitimacy to be a victim, but she has to prove her innocence. Rape by allies is somewhat suspicious as victim's agency may serve. Prostitution for economic reason and not for economic and not for economic is illegitimate with the assumption of consent. Romance and marriage cannot be legitimized as victimhood as it is assumed active participation with consent. In Chapter 11, Fumika Sato, a sociologist, offered a diagram of continuable legitimacy of narratives based on the degree of the participation of the agency. But how can you draw a line in this continuum? Then the question is, what is the constant after all when there is a continuum between compulsion and consent? Let's see. Here we introduce the concept of the structural violence by Johan Galtung, peace activist and in peace studies. Violence is not limited blood and brutal physical violence, but extended to the social and economic compulsion. Roberts cite a word of German soldier about local woman in the occupied area. This is a citation. They opened their legs for a piece of bread. There's no need of threatening nor exercising violence. So can you call it a consent? How can we say there is a consent, yet there is a divide between speakable damage and unspeakable damage in this continuum? Today, historians deal with not only document, but also memory and testimony, which is later constructed. Redefinition of the past experience can shift the divide line according to the context. This is how, the Me Too movement can take place, which enabled to identify abuse of power by producer Weinstein with sexual violence, which was once considered as a honey trap. So this kind of redefinition takes place, raised by the Me Too movement. Though sexual violence is not negligible in history, women's victimhood is always treated as a second-class victimhood. Let's see now. Then we have this, the Chapter 8 by Himeoka Toshiko. She is a German historian in Japan. She wrote about the, prostitution in the concentration camp run by Nazis. Well, other than the examples of the above, there must be many black holes in history. Sexual violence is particularly tabooed issue and ignored by historians, even by modern historians. In Chapter 9, Ryuichi Narita, you may be familiar with him because he was here, and he argues why Japanese modern history failed to encounter sexual violence in war. So it's been tabooed and ignored. Though sexual violence is not negligible in history, women's victimhood is always treated as the second-class victimhood of second-class citizens. In Toshiko and Himeoka in Chapter 8, while dealing with prostitution and the concentration camps in Nazi Germany, points out that those, that the former women who are working in the former prostitution in the camp are not entitled as a legitimate victims of the Holocaust and excluded from the claim for compensation by organized group of Holocaust survivors. They are not entitled, they are not qualified by even by their survivors. Then, I want to, introduce, this book again by Rim Hee-jae-hyun, a Korean historian interested enough in Polish history, and wrote a controversial book entitled with Victimhood Nationalism in Contested Memories. He was criticized for making comparison between Holocaust and other genocide. Because, Holocaust is considered to be one and unique in history, uncomparable with anything else that the Jewish community claimed. But, that this kind of comparison is made possible between, Hiroshima and Rwanda. But this comparison caused anger among Jewish community who believe Holocaust is the only one and unique historical event. However, there is an appropriation of victimhood by remote nationalism, which takes advantage of using Holocaust as a metaphor to evaluate the degree of victimhood, asking who is entitled to be ultimate victims and whose victimhood is more important and serious. Oops, no, this is the end actually. So I have to reach the conclusion of my speech. Then in what light can we make comparative history? It does not aim at making a rank order of victimhood. Rather, it aims to extend our perspective to compare something with what has not seen as comparable. And my point is stop making hierarchy or pyramid of victimhood. In that sense, women's victimization always comes next and second. And what we should, stop making the pyramid of victimhood. And so at the very end, I'd like to put this sentence to you. Let me say, there's no forbidden question in history. So that's why we can now make this comparative history of sexual violence in war. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. And I don't know whether to be inspired or depressed.
Then we had a progress to have this paradigm shift.
Yeah, well, now we have to make the paradigm shift real. The no forbidden questions in history is a really good way to also suggest that once you bring up these questions and they see the light of day, then what happens potentially are such things as paradigm shifts and changes in policy and one hopes in behavior. But these are deeply embedded structures. We'll leave it that way. And to me, what you're doing in this book is showing the structures. And I think maybe that's the first answer to the no forbidden questions, just revealing the deep structures and also the continuity, this business of the continuity from rape to romance. And that was real, and that's real in wartime. And it's either the romance part is equally condemned as the prostitution is, or it's sundered. The romance part is cut off from the violence. So these are really changes in the way we see things. It's not just revealing what went on and the horrors of it. So it's really very, very helpful, even if it's distressing. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. And since we have such a big audience, so few microphones, what Julie suggests is that you say something and I repeat it by the microphone. Okay, go ahead.
I want to ask about what is the feminist way of doing research, doing feminist studies, relatively, and they own your reader. Because what's important is that nowadays we see feminism getting more and more popular, especially I think you talked about how Chinese women, Chinese people are very look out to you, probably women. And when people organize community or having an event such as today, we often activists want to see that people organizing in a feminist way. And I don't feel like we talk enough that okay, we have both, we study gender, we study feminism in theory, but how that applies to places we go, events we attend. For example, today, for many people here or people outside of the door, that it's a very precious kind of resource for us to see in person. And versus, I think there's a better way, that more feminist way to run this event. Not have anything against the university, but I know you have toured around the world, and I just want to know if it's in the only regard that people not just talk about feminism in theory, in history, but also in action and how that applies.
Do I hear two questions there? Is there one question about how you do feminist research? Is that the first question, or is there one question which is is feminist research enough? Do you need feminist action? Are there two questions?
There are two questions, but the first question is I want to know if it's on her regard. What is the meaning for her
Of
feminism outside of
scholarship. Okay, okay, got it. I think you've all heard it then. So the question, and I'd like to come back to you later, but the question is it on Professor Ueno's agenda or her radar of feminism outside scholarship and research? I think you know the answer. What's the answer?
Do you see the gap between the theory and the practice? I don't say it, actually. You know, that the feminist research was quite effective, both in theory and in practice. I mean, they really encouraged, victimized survivors to speak out and put it open to public and encourage them to put it to the court and others. And after all, they won. And with the support of, feminist researchers as well as feminist attorneys and others. So it became very much effective in practice. Prior to this practice, we actually need definition of the sexual violence, Otherwise, that it has to be kept silence. So in this case, I showed some of the examples such as, Ishida Yoneko made a very enduring research working together with Chinese rural women to take it not as a shame, but as a forced victimhood by the community and by the Japanese military. Then after all, they got this, gravity to bring it to the court. So they're quite supportive, not just as a researcher, but also an activist. It works both ways. We need both.
And there was a real outcome here.
Yes.
Rape was defined as a crime against humanity for the first time in the history in the preamble to the International Criminal Court in 1998. And it was, and in every article, argument promoting that provision, the comfort women were mentioned. And the comfort women were mentioned because of all the feminists, not only women, but feminists, including men, and the attorneys you mentioned, because of everything they had done in the 10 years before that. So that's a real outcome.
Yes.
And that's real action with consequence.
Another outcome is that that the Nobel Peace Prize winners, that they changed the criteria of Nobel Peace Prize as well.
I mean, so it really depends this is one area in which the scholarship, the definition plus the empirical scholarship, plus the activism, which went with it, hand in hand, plus the mock tribunal in 2000 in Tokyo, all of these things, plus the Bosnian rape camps and the feminist international human rights lawyers. Hard to see an example where scholarship so directly in its activism produced outcomes. So that, you may want a different outcome. This one really had an outcome and still is having one. So, I think you have something else in mind. Okay, other questions? Yeah, then you, sorry. Go first and then you, okay.
So thank you so much, Professor Ueno, for the great presentation. And a quickly response to the previous question, I think our concern or the things that we are kind of trying to figure out is that for all these outcomes we've seen, like including the tribunals that we created and continue to do, even with today's crime in the war zone, and also the resolution 1325 that we are following, trying to increase women, peace, and security. All these outcomes are the things that I actually learned as a student who studied global affairs with a concentration on global gender studies. But I do see that a lot of my peers in China, they don't know about the outcomes. I know there's a need of education for sure, whether it's by ourselves to self-educate or like follow the route to learn from academia path. But at the same time, I was wondering, you mentioned about Me Too movement, like how it actually helped to redefine the definition of sexual violence, and also how to make the stigmatization less of a
barrier for these survivors to come out. So do you think there's a way for activists around the world to better kind of combine Me Too movement with the work that we're trying to do in terms of support survivors of the war crimes, and especially those who've been like in this victimhood for so long, especially in our East Asian part, because comfort women topic, as far as I know, is not very kind of openly talked about in a lot of Western feminist kind of community compared with some other kind of war-related crime topics. So yeah, that's kind of my question.
Okay, very quickly, do you not see a way to combine the activism of Me Too, which is in the here and now, with the activism directed to the compensation and recognition for victims of the past? Comfort women are not necessarily known far and wide in feminist activist circles. So Me Too and comfort women activism.
But actually, you're very much connected internationally. And the 2000 Women's Tribunal was really an achievement by the transnational feminism, and covering a variety of, people from the other countries. And so, in other words, talking about the Me Too movement, I mean, are you from China? I mean, at this moment, the Chinese women don't have a much, social space for feminist activism. But now, that we do have the community of Chinese residents in Tokyo, and they get together to make some civil space for themselves. So in my case, I run this, NPO Women's Action Network, and I had a visit by, Jai Chan-Zu is her name, who brought her sexual harassment case to the court and failed. But at the end of this, court, she made a wonderful speech. Though I lost this lawsuit, I won the victory in my identity or something, So I asked her to bring her speech to Japan on our website and translate it into English and Japanese so that you can see, you can read it on our website. So this kind of, the international connections is made already. So we actually interact each other. And so it actually goes beyond the boundary. So, in this time of the internet community, you just cannot ban the information. So we are connected already, I think.
Yes, I'm sorry, yours next.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for giving us such an impressive speech. I totally agree with your final sentence that there is no forbidden question in history, just as I'm from J school, there's also no forbidden question in journalism. But when I was doing interview with those like female victims, I always feel like I usually cry a lot with them when I was interviewing. I wonder, like during your research, when you're interviewing those female victims, how did you prevent yourself from like trigger them for a second during the interview? And my second question would be, like, there's a generational gap in, for example, me and my mothers, we through the stigmatization of sexual violence. I know that this is like a toxic kindness that my grandma and my mothers, they would kindly notice me for my own goods, but I also feel like they're the victims of patriarchy in this kind of concept. So how should I face them? Like, this is more microscopic question. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, two questions. When you're interviewing survivors of sexual violence, it's upsetting to you, but have you thought about it, how it might upset them by bringing the memories back? And the second question is, there are generational differences here. Her generation different from her mothers and grandmothers who are more victimized by patriarchy. And so how do you deal with, that's a personal question, how do you deal with the generational, it's a family question basically, how do you deal with your mother? But it's important because the generations are so important here. So two questions.
Yeah, well, for the first one question, the emotional sympathization is nothing wrong with interviewing. that you don't have to be neutral. I mean, in scientific research, that we even don't have to call it scientific. We call it participant observation. I mean, you participate in making a narrative. So, I mean, interviewing is not just neutral, objective, research. It's actually active participation in creating a new narrative in process of redefinition of their experiences. So, I mean, we took a role, not just as a researcher, but as a participant in this process. That's a feminist action research is for. So this may answer to that first question. And the other thing about the second one, the generational gap. Yeah, I understand that, that I recently had, the question from a young woman who had sexual harassment at the job interviews. And when she wanted to tell this story to her, who is the most intimate woman to her, but her mother denied to listen to her. So she really didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to face it, even though it was her daughter's experience. So this is kind of the generational gap within the family you can't overcome. But in the long run, that if you know that your daughter is in some trouble, why not being supportive to her for mothers? So that's what mothers should do. Yes. And you can also change your mother.
Good luck with that. I have to repeat because we're getting some notices from the Zoom that they're not hearing your question. So I'll repeat what you just said. You have to change yourself, and perhaps, and you said maybe change your mother. Thank you. I want to take one question from Zoom, if I might, please, which is, can you explain what remote nationalism is?
In this globalization, you have this kind of widespread, the move of, people with different origins here and there in the world. So, for instance, I already give you the example of the Glendale case, by Armenian community. And they took advantage of, the comfort women issue to make their own victimization in the history more visible. So this kind, the Armenian, those are the Americans with the Armenian origin, and away from the home country for generations, but still they keep, this national memory. So, reproduce a kind of nationalism in remote areas. So it's called remote nationalism. Now, you have the Chinese-speaking community all over the world and the Korean-speaking community all over the world and the Japanese as well here and there. But so in this case, comfort women just transplants here and there all over the world. It happens in Glendale, in Berlin, in other part of the world. It takes place everywhere in the world. So it's called remote nationalism.
Sometimes called diasporic nationalism?
No, not really. They are diaspora. They are legal migrants.
Yeah, but it's something, maybe that's wrong, but it is sometimes called that. People who live in other countries who are like Korean Americans, for example, and comfort women.
But even though they belong to the second or third generation, born in that host land.
Diaspora.
No. They still reproduce nationalism, remote nationalism.
Exactly. Anyway, that's what it means. It means nationalism for another nation when it doesn't matter what generation you are. A couple questions from two more from the Zoom group, which is that they are the same.
Who are they?
Well,
on Zoom.
I tell you who they are if I could figure out how to use this computer a little bit better. But let me tell you what the question is, all right? The question has to do with what can we do about it, all right? It has to do with the systemic, the structures. What can we do to break this? Second, I'll tell you the other word. The other way is what do you and your co-authors propose to advance this research after the comfort women have passed away, which is what's happening, and other World War II people. All right, so how do we change this deeply embedded structural precarity? That's the other one. So the two people talked about how do we change the structures, and the other person wants to know how do you study these things when you don't have people to talk to anymore? World War II.
So that remains a long period of time, actually. And so it reproduces again and again. But first of all, what we can do as a researcher is to break the taboo and so to make it speakable. And I don't know how to solve this question. I mean, you are facing unpredictable things, happening in Gaza, in Ukraine, and even here at the presidential election. What happens, You can't control. But, you can make it very open to public and break the taboo to the unspoken experiences, especially with women. And women always comes next to everything because, women's victimhood is actually less valued as a second citizen.
And what about studying the sexual violence in periods when you cannot interview people? That was the other question.
Well, you can't bury the black hole of the history. There may be many of them, but if you can't make it visible, you just cannot see it.
Well, speaking as a historian who doesn't do interviews, there are all kinds of ways to get at this if you ask the question. The first way to do it is to ask the question. The reason these are unspoken or unstudied or invisible is because people haven't asked the question. It's not that the resources aren't there, and they are there for back into the beginnings of recorded time,
But if they are no longer alive, how can do it?
Not by interviews, but there's always material. Not about everything. And it's true that sexuality is not the subject that is, there's no
it's not
folder for that in the foreign. Yeah, exactly. But we have ways now. We certainly have ways in social history of finding out, not necessarily by name, a certain person.
That's true. But, actually, we can have a different perspective to look at the same thing. That's what, that Hirai did, that he, very carefully checked that, journals and diaries written by soldiers and who went to the comfort station and who didn't. So it was actually the very new perspective of what she brought into this, that the soldier's diary.
Yeah, exactly. So there are ways of doing it. Let me come back to the room now. Is there a question over there in the back? Yeah.
I'm wondering, you have written several more books that are towards, the common readers, such as the book about misogyny. And I'm kind of curious to, in addition to kind of informing people who might not be feminists or who might not have read a lot about feminism, about the topic, I'm wondering kind of what you want your readers to do, or what do you think your readers can do after reading your book?
So are there two questions? Oh, I have to say it because nobody on Zoom can hear you. Yes. What do you want the readers of your popular books? Is that what the question is?
Yeah.
So what you write popular books, what do you want the readers of your popular books to take from them or to do about it? What is your popular audience? What do you hope for from them?
Here, for instance, I introduced several technical words in gender studies such as sexual harassment, domestic violence, and misogyny that are not Japanese originally. So now, I listen to the youngsters, talking to each other. In their conversation, they just very naturally use these words, sexual harassment and homosocial and misogyny and so forth. And in Japanese, they have this abbreviation of the words to make it very short. And when I listen to some youngsters' conversation, they talk about homoso. What is it? Then I come to realize it means homosocial, So it becomes so popular. So we introduce this word into the very daily conversation. Now make it possible for them to describe some patriarchal phenomenon, This is what happens.
It's a naming. You're giving words, names to, yes.
Naming is very, important for the definition, such as you have, mansplaining, this explains a lot.
So what you've been repeating several times is that it's important to find out what happened. It's important to say what happened, and it's important to name what happened. And this is the soil from which changes in attitude grow. And from changes in attitude, you do get changes in reality. I mean, you can show that in history. So it's a little bit more time consuming than you might like. I mean, it's a little bit slower, but there is a connection among these activities, the scholarly, the activism, etc., into what you might want to call real change. Somebody else in the audience here? Yeah, in the back, you, please. Over there. Yeah. Over there. No, all the way in the back, because you were first. Yeah.
Wondering what you have about domestic violence.
Domestic violence on the home front. Is that what you said? So we talked about violence.
Home front means during the war? Because you know that the men are away.
Just a second. Just a second. I'm sensitive to the Zoom audience, which cannot hear anything that you all say. So let me just repeat what you said. You want to know, we've talked about violence in war. We have not talked about sexual violence on the home front. Is that the question? And now you said, go ahead, say it again.
First of all, there's no statistics made by the government. No one paid attention about the domestic violence. The other thing that, living in the home front, which means, that their husbands are away from the home. So how they could make domestic violence. And also, this, statistics was made it possible only after the 1995 the Beijing conference and something. And so at the beginning, women's collective made action research, feminist action research to make it possible. And so in that case, 58% of the women experienced the domestic violence, which is a big number, very shameful number for Japan. And then it was widespread in the UN report. I mean, because, that the UN official asked the Japanese government if they had, any report on the domestic violence. They had no. But this person in charge produced, there is one women's collective who did this, that it's a kind of a voluntary, questionnaire to answer. So it made it high rate, 58%. All of a sudden, Japanese government find it very shameful. Then they decided to make a so-called scientific research. So it comes out, 26% of women experienced domestic violence, which is slightly lower than the American women.
That's what they wanted.
Yes. Yeah. And it's slightly, more than the Canadian women. So it's about the same, almost the standard of the advanced countries.
But they're all undercounted. Because we now know that domestic violence here is way over 50%, but it's just not counted. I mean, these statistics. It's this women second class business again, so that you don't get the statistics on domestic violence
unless you have this category of domestic violence. Nothing can be visible.
And even when you have a category, it's in this country. There's ways of rendering it invisible, even after there's a category. So there's a lot of work to do. One last question here, and then one more from here. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Can you speak out a little bit more louder? Yes.
About Korea, Japan, China, but there's also other wars and recurring wars in the worldwide. So is there a special pattern in East Asia which is different from other parts of the world?
Special pattern. Well, you answered it with the Mulhäuser book and the Roberts book. Is there a special pattern to sexual violence against women in war in East Asia compared to other parts of the world? In this case, let's call it the European War, World War II.
It depends on the context. In the case of Roberts' book, that those GI soldiers were welcomed by French women as liberators.
But they raped the women.
They did. But in case of Germany and also in Japan, that they are actually the invaders into the foreign land. And so there was, the hostility between them. And so that makes a difference. And also in many areas in Japan, when that the Japanese military advanced into the different directions in China and in South and other directions, occupied area is very much different in context. So I can't tell. So actually, this book, with this, collected papers, tells you quite a variety of experiences of what happened according by context. Each article is very well written, I admit. I guarantee.
Good. We have to get it translated.
Right.
And one person wants to know when the English title and the table of contents. We can deal with that later. I think we have to stop now. There's one question here that we might be good to end with, which is, what will be your next research if without any reality limitations?
Without what?
What are those reality limitations? What would be your next research if you had no reality limitations? In other words, what would you do if you could do anything? What would you research?
Maybe space travel? No. Okay, I'm serious, that actually, as I'm aged, I'm more interested in aging and caregiving. So that's my main research, aging in place, even though you are single in your household. Could it be possible? Yes, it is. With this, long-term caretaking insurance back in Japan, I was about to give this lecture on this issue. I would love to if I have time.
Come back.
Yeah.
I mean, this is another intervention in contemporary society. There are so many. What's the number of aging households with single women in Japan? Percentage?
Well, limited to the aged population only, it's 27% of the entire household as a single.
Single aged women.
Yes. Not only women, but including both.
Oh, including both.
Both men and women. So I don't belong to the minority anymore. The number counts,
So this is a contemporary social issue in Japan. I mean,
Right.
What do you do? There are many more women than men in those single households. So there's plenty of work.
Gender issue, right?
Yeah, it's the gender issue. So there's a lot to do for those of you who want to get things done. And this is as I say, this is an active intervention. Well, I want to thank you very much. I want to thank all of you very much, and hope you'll come back again and talk about aging.
Well, I hope so. But maybe in that time I'll be too aged.
I don't think so. So thank you.